Hey, hi everyone. This is my presentation called the Fraught Identity. Who here knows absolutely everything to do with PHP development and programming?
Everything.
No hands? Good, because I didn't plan if anybody did put their hand up. But on the other side of the scale, there'll be people that's sitting here in the audience that are the complete opposite to that. They just feel like frauds. And it's fairly commonplace in our industry. Studies suggested about 68% of people suffer from kind of a chronic desire, a chronic inability to recognise their own achievements. As somebody that grapples with this daily, I'm surprised it's actually not higher. The kind of perverse irony is that it actually probably is. The people that just suffer from it won't be prepared to admit it. What I'm talking about has a name, and it's called Impostor Syndrome. Impostor Syndrome characterises individuals marked with an inability to recognise their achievements and accomplishments. They suffer from the crushing weight that somebody somewhere is going to shine a massive great spotlight on them and expose them as a fraud. And it will bring their entire world crumbling down around them. As an observer to somebody that's in this state, the obvious thing would seem to be to point out their successes. But if you are suffering from it, then that can sometimes just seem irrelevant, because the sufferer may just believe that they've got to their position of seniority or experience just by pure blind luck, fortunate timing, or even kind of an undesired deception on their part. Imagine kind of a scenario where you're presenting to a room full of people, say, and you have, let's say, 50 people in the audience. I'm trying to big myself up here. And 48% of those people are, afterwards, they say, oh yeah, you know what, he did a good job, or I think I've learnt something from some of these points. And then 2 people say, I'm not really sure about that, I'm not sure I got anything from it, thought it was a bit shit. As a presenter, who am I going to listen to? Am I going to listen to the 48 people that told me I did a good job, or am I going to listen to the 2 that batted me down? Obviously, I'm going to probably listen to the 2. There's also a correlation between how far you are in your career or the level of seniority you take in your own discipline and imposter syndrome. So we've all encountered kind of fresh-faced new members of a team, the sort of people that have come into development and reckon that they kind of already know everything. Kind of people that already sit around about here on the hype scale. These people are great to work with. Their enthusiasm is infectious. They know absolutely everything about what they're going to do. They're propelled almost entirely, though, by small-scale victories. They see the direct result of what they do, and it's brilliant, and it works for them. But to be blunt, it can sometimes lead to an inflated sense of achievement. After all, they are still learning. It's just because they are embarking on their path doesn't mean that there's still a lot to learn, basically. And it's quite often experienced, the people that have been around the block a bit, people that have had their hands burned by various techniques, that often doubt themselves. And this has a name too. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And I mean, don't let the kind of Comic Sans put you off here. It's actually quite detailed and impressive research, done by people with much more expensive educations than mine and good double-barrel surnames. It's sometimes referred to as illusory superiority, and it's where a person of low ability perceives their understanding as greater than it actually is. And obviously, the inverse of that. People that have developed a broader understanding of their field are more aware of what they don't know. The graph here doesn't necessarily represent the path that somebody will take on their career. There'll be some people that are overly cautious, some people that will never kind of climb the heady heights at the start. And there's also the young and enthusiastic people that just pick up the new stuff all the time, and then they never reach this peak, which apparently is called Mount Stupid. And you can be on multiple instances of this path at the same time as well. It's not like you finish one path and you immediately join the next. If you join a new project, if you join a new company, or if you take on a freelance project, you can be at various different cycles for this. And it doesn't just apply to development either. For some examples, I'm going to show you what's going on in my life at the moment. There's always that new JavaScript framework. Every week a new one comes out and you join the hype train. I keep telling myself every time not to do that, but it does, and it happens. This is currently where I am about stubbing my toe on a bed frame. This is a really dangerous part to be on, because you've ridden the hype train. I've done 2 years maybe without stubbing my toe on my own bed in the middle of the night. Until last night, where I got up and promptly smacked my shin into the side of it. Moving on, office politics. You think you get a good grasp of that until another curveball's thrown at you and you're right back down at the bottom again, wallowing in your little pit of despair you've got. Or at least I do. And the last one, in my 27 years, I think I'm almost getting the grasp of not choking on my own food. And just as enthusiastic as these kind of I can do anything attitudes, it can be really healthy. Self-doubt is too. Kind of fear of the unknown, fear of failure, comprehension of challenge is something they're all elemental attributes of our psyche that we've learnt over millions of years. So you shouldn't ignore it, but at the same time you shouldn't be dogged by it. Cautiousness as a trait, however, does not automatically mean imposter syndrome. And I've made a loose comparison deliberately there, because some types are. So why do so many people with what I would class as enviable levels of experience? I mean, I work with people, I've met people that their intelligence in their field is intimidating. Why do so many of them suffer from imposter syndrome? And it's most commonly due to a warped ability to benchmark yourself against others. Picture a typical kind of water cooler conversation or office debate. Two of your colleagues are talking about the merits of Symfony over Zen Framework. These debates run rife in teams all over the place. I've seen it happen loads of times. They seem to you to be talking very comprehensively about the two different frameworks. They're talking about the merits, the disadvantages. They use an easy familiarity with knowing what's in each of them. And then you wander along and they pick on you and say, what do you think? And at this point you're running through a number of different scenarios in your head because you haven't used that framework. And you think, oh God, somebody of my experience, they should have used that. I can't possibly roll over, reveal my underbelly and just say, you know what, I'm sorry guys, I haven't used this. You just actually go off and utter some kind of meaningless platitude like, oh, they both have their faults, don't they? And then move on. And then you go back to your desk and you sit and you quietly hate yourself. Perhaps I'm just literally describing my own experiences here, I don't know. But you've kind of done yourself a disadvantage here. And this graph kind of shows what you're thinking in your head at the time. And but here's the thing, you could be a complete whiz with Laravel, for instance. You could have a lot of experience with another framework, or the reason perhaps you haven't touched ZF is because you've heard their documentation is not up to scratch, or certainly not comparable. And kind of spoiler alert, it isn't. In the heat of that encounter, you didn't consider that as being relevant to the discussion. After all, your colleagues were having a discussion about two other things. But it's also important, it is relevant for your own internal evaluation of what's just happened. because you need to put the context of that against your own internal evaluation and confidence. Because instead of thinking like this, the reality probably looks a lot more like that. Nobody's more experienced in what you know than you are, and there's going to be crossover between you and your colleagues. This kind of unfortunate pairing is even more of a problem now because we have the wonderful world of social media, and I don't just mean this from development, but it's not just an interaction between two colleagues you have now. Anybody with a laptop and an internet connection all around the globe can point a finger at you and expose your insecurities if you're the person or the newbie on a forum that goes and asks a question. So it can be intimidating. You only have to go and look at the PHP subreddit, for instance. That can be a pretty hostile and volatile place sometimes. So I realise I've painted a pretty bleak picture of this so far, and I don't want to distract from that because it is tough. There's no magic bullet for fixing your thinking to get out of imposter syndrome, but there are a couple of strategies and kind of healthier ways of thinking, so I'm going to go through a couple of them now. Firstly, you need to feel more done. It's an unpleasant feeling if you're not used to it, feeling out of your depth somewhere. If you're working, but also if you're working somewhere where you're never challenged, you never get into that position of feeling out of your depth. So when you first do, it's really jarring. You don't know how to react to it. So just why not throw yourself in at the deep end? I mean, there's greater questions if you're not being challenged where you are, but you can at least challenge yourself. Speaking from experience, there's nothing more or humbling or quite like working somewhere where you feel like an idiot all the time. It happened to me. It's happened to me a number of times, every time I've kind of taken another rung up the ladder in my career. At first, it's really, really daunting. It's a horrible feeling. You just feel like you're never going to progress anywhere. You're feeling like you're surrounded by people that are just, well, you're waiting to be exposed. Again, it comes back to my original point. But after a while, it becomes a little softer, and it can become addictive, or at least that's what I've found. You begin to thrive on those challenges. You don't know about something, you go off, you learn it, you speak to somebody that does, and that person will help you. If you start to feel daft more often, it'll hurt less. And it also gives you a kind of an armour to then challenge things that you previously never would have questioned. You need to maintain some good company. This point applies to the people you work with. They not only need to be smarter, but they do need to give you that guidance I mentioned. I've worked with people before that have been incredibly smart, incredibly well-versed in their discipline, but these same people would take actual pride in kind of demonstrating that they had a better grasp of the concept than you. If somebody does that to somebody that is suffering from imposter syndrome, I mean, what's that going to do? That's a really toxic atmosphere. And the same thing happens in a lot of interviews as well. I mean, how many people here have been to a technical interview where you've had a written test? Yeah, okay, so a good number of people. How many of you actually thought that written test was good? Okay, so there's no hands for that. So many of them that I've seen have been, can you order these parameters in the string pos function or the substrings function? What use is that? And then you've got some interviewer sat across the table from you that's saying, oh, well, you've got these two the wrong way around, you can't even get a basic function right, you must use this all the time. Is that really the measure of somebody? If you work with great people, people that you trust, and people that you're not afraid to reveal your ignorance to, suddenly your kind of previously shadowy demeanour, when you've been suffering from your imposter syndrome, can actually be turned into quite a liberating feeling. Your energy can be challenged into learning. And it will also opens up avenues for more effective pair programming and other best practices that will make you a better developer. The next one is perspective. People are notoriously bad at judging their own accomplishments, and this can lead to feelings of inadequacy. You can... Sorry, I've lost my part here. It can be helped if you have a mentor. And a great mentor doesn't have to necessarily be a more senior developer, a senior engineer. It just needs to be somebody that can offer you that perspective on what you're doing. So the principles of good management apply here. They're there to empower you, they're there to offer honest feedback and give you the perspective on your own accomplishments that you probably can't give yourself. And finding a mentor can be a challenging thing, but the social media and the kind of global network of people that we work with in this day is also, that I criticised earlier for pointing fingers at you, can also help in this regard. Your mentor doesn't have to be somebody you know personally. There's just as many mentors out there in the digital world as people seeking to be mentored. A lot of the time though, you just actually need to be fairer to yourself. Every interaction you have with somebody, that conversation I mentioned earlier, that hypothetical scenario, that person you're speaking to is presenting their sanitized, manicured, polished projection, what they want you to see from them. And you don't have that luxury when you're in that moment. You have to, you get the kind of R-rated, nebulous, warts and all quagmire, the horrible mess that goes on inside your head. And somehow you have to compute and catalogue that and communicate it back effectively and almost instantly. So kind of give yourself a break. That other person's doing it, you just don't see it. Kind of stop comparing your cutting room floor with everybody else's highlight reel is essentially how that could be distilled. So fail fast and often. And I've actually clicked that too far forward. You need to be able to create a working environment where failure is not punished and sometimes even encouraged. And this isn't an excuse for apathy or to capitalise on your own incompetence. But it's about learning to make more evidence-based decisions. And again, the principles of good science apply here. You have a hypothesis of solving a problem. You have a method, or you devise a method of fixing it. You implement that method, but then you evaluate afterwards. And there's no finger pointing. There's no, oh, let's see who we can blame afterwards. It's about if what you've chosen to implement fails, then you learn from that and move on. It's a case of that failure being just as useful to know as the success. And that's really difficult if you don't get company buy-in. But you can, to a limited extent, apply that to yourself at least. The Agile Retrospective Prime Directive that I've already clicked through to highlights this really well. So even those that don't work in an Agile environment, because I know not everybody does in our field, it's still a good motto, I think, to work by. It boils down to me to if you asked yourself the question, if you were given the same knowledge, the same materials and the same resources you were given at the start of a project, would you do the same thing again? And if you would, then you've got absolutely no reason to feel inferior. And kind of try to be objective about this, because, as I've already explained, this cognitive bias aspect of imposter syndrome means that your brain is already creating faulty assumptions based on bad data, faulty conclusions, sorry. And the last thing is, you're actually part of something, doing what we do. For most people that program or that develop tools and applications, it's more than just a job. I mean, I'm going to ask for another poll here. Who here does what they do exclusively just to be paid by it? So everyone here has entertained at least what they do on a hobbyist level at some point. And that's really great. We're motivated by an enjoyment of solving problems, by challenging ourselves and creating things that hundreds, thousands, if not tens of thousands of people use. Stuff we make actually has an impact on what people do. Because of what we do, someone somewhere is now able to do something or experience something they weren't able to do before. And the person that is able to do that certainly wouldn't think of you as a fraud. You've enabled them to do what they need to do. You've enriched part of their life, however small. I said earlier that there's no magic bullet for ending this cycle of thinking. My experience has taught me that progressive and incremental kind of improvements in the way I think helps mitigate some of the issues I have with imposter syndrome. If there's kind of one snippet that I'd like people to take away from what I've rambled on about today, it's that imposter syndrome is a lot more common than you think it is. I said at the start it's 68%. We're all engineers and software developers here. We know that that is probably an underestimate based on that kind of survey. And everybody here tonight, simply by virtue of being here, has committed themselves to doing something more than just their vocation. They're here because they enjoy the community. They're here because they want to learn something extra. They're here because they just love what they do. And honestly, would a fraud do that? So thanks for listening. I hope somebody got something from that. I've been a developer for about 10 years now, and this is the first time I've spoken in front of people before, so I do want some feedback. Based on my experience at conferences, I think this is where I tell people to follow me on Twitter. I mean, you can do if you want to, but all I use it for is complaining to companies and customer service departments. So if you want to learn something, you're not going to. I'd much rather actually that you rate the meetup group and rate my performance tonight, because both I and the meetup group benefit from that, and it gains us more exposure through the website. So thank you very much.
Impostor syndrome, something you've been aware of for a while. Do you look at treating other people as well? If you see other people, do you do anything to assist them?
So the question is, if you observe imposter syndrome in somebody else, should you act? Is that fair? As a mentor. Well, I guess to that, everybody is different. You should never tell, if you suspect somebody has suffered from imposter syndrome, you should never tell somebody that, because then they just have a name for what they're feeling. It doesn't help anything. But in terms of how you coach somebody through that, I probably come back to what I said earlier, is you're there to empower them. You need to demonstrate to them their own accomplishments from a different perspective. Certainly from me, that's helped me no end. Suddenly I think that tiny little thing that I did in my head, actually somebody reaped some real benefit from that. And for me, it needed somebody else to tell me that. So that's probably a good starting point, but your own relationship with whoever you're mentoring probably should factor more into what you choose to do. Any other questions?
Do you think it will help, or do you know of a platform where people can help other developers mentoring online?
Okay, so the question is, do I know of a platform where mentors can help mentees? I'm not sure if there's one specifically with that theme, but I would go back to GitHub, to be honest. If you start contributing to something in the open source community, it may be brutal at first, but you'll get other people reviewing your code, and that's certainly a good avenue into building up a relationship with someone. There's a guy called Gary Hockin, I think his name is. He did a fantastic closing keynote to PHP UK in February. It's on YouTube that I'd recommend reading. And that essentially is what kind of propelled his journey from a kind of very amateurish, hobbyist developer into now being a developer advocate for JetBrains. He just forged relationships through contributing to open source software and the Zen framework. So I'd recommend that.
More of a continuation of where to find mentors. I, believe it or not, Reddit and IRC.
Okay.
Places that help me a ton. There's a lot of noise, and you have to be prepared to filter that out. But you find 1 or 2 people in there that are ridiculously helpful and will listen to pretty much any question.
Okay, so just for the recording, somebody said that Reddit and IRC are very good channels for this as well.
And something that someone recommended to me at a conference, which I was disappointed that I didn't volunteer on. I think there was something called PHPmentoring.com, which is quite literally a site to connect. I don't know if that's actually the address, but someone pointed out in a talk I saw like this at a conference.
Okay, so apparently there's a website called phpmentoring.com where it's specifically designed to pair people together like this. So yeah, that's worth checking out. Any other questions from anybody? Okay, well thank you very much.